Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Louisa and today I really want to get into what all of the different types of meditation are, what it means when it talks about Christian meditation in the Bible, why Eastern meditation is not the same thing, and also how the research is not very good on it. So hopefully you've got yourself a beverage and we can get into this. There is a lot of information and I am going to add all of the links into the description box underneath. So you can check out all of the different articles and all of the different studies that I'm referencing in this and have a read through for yourself. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe, and if you have your own experiences with meditation, then feel free to leave them in the comments. So meditation and mindfulness are really heavily promoted in mental health and psychology. They always cite a whole plethora of different studies, and they basically tout it as some kind of panacea for the masses. I have never heard a mental health professional actually discuss any of the pitfalls, and pretty much none of them that I know of are even aware of what the risks are. However, if meditation was some kind of pill, or if it was subject to some kind of drug trial before it was released on the general population, it would not pass muster based on the evidence that is actually out there. And it would have been subjected to a lot more scrutiny than what it has been, because a lot of the studies are only interested in the benefits and not interested in what the problems are. There's also absolutely no constraint on who can teach this stuff, who can recommend this stuff, and who can do guided meditations. So you can download an app and you don't necessarily know what the source is. You're not really guided through it in a one-to-one situation where if very difficult thoughts come up, someone can actually talk it through with you. Meditation and mindfulness in a lot of ways have become something that is replacing CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's not the same, and CBT is very strictly monitored. Like, you have to be a mental health professional in order to administer it. The terms are also a little bit ambiguous as to what is meant by meditation and mindfulness, and they often get conflated with things like prayer, and in fact they can be associated with prayer when it comes to different studies. So in other words, the benefits of prayer, which have actually been substantiated, then get associated with meditation, lumped into the same category and recommended as the same thing, which they're not. So I'm going to outline a number of studies which have looked at the risks of it, and a number of anecdotal articles which have been published in various different journals. So when it comes to psychology, there's kind of two various different ways that you can approach research. You can go by case studies, which are individual people's accounts, what's going on with them, and then there are quantitative studies, which actually study multiple large groups of people potentially. Case studies are good at sort of getting down into the nitty-gritty and figuring out various different mechanisms, but quantitative studies are really good for generalizing across a population and seeing how prevalent something is. So it sort of sorts out whether a case study is some kind of aberration or if it actually points to a flaw in a particular practice. So in this situation, we need to look at both. When it comes to things like spiritual practices and spiritual advice, we tend to play a little fast and loose with various different things. And in particular, if you sort of use the analogy of like a financial planner, if you went to a financial planner and they said to you, don't worry about your spending, just do whatever makes you feel good, that would be bad financial advice. And yet when it comes to spiritual matters, people go to meditation retreats and New Age teachers, and those people say, don't worry about what is wrong and right, there is no rules, you can just do whatever you feel like, just go with your feelings. And it's like, that is bad spiritual advice. But that's kind of where meditation has been lumped in. And Eastern meditation was not considered to be a practice for the masses. It was not considered to be for people who were uninitiated. So as I said before, there is a big difference between Eastern meditation and prayer, but when it comes to psychology and what they're recommending, they kind of lump them all into the same category, and it's a very faulty system of logic. So I've had people on this channel leaving comments about, you don't know what you're talking about, you're full of crap. Meditation is the same as prayer because it uses the same brainwave frequencies. And if you applied that kind of logic across other sectors of life, the sort of logic where it basically says mechanism equals good, like if the mechanism for two different things is the same, then both of those things is good. If you applied that kind of logic to something like sex, it would mean that consensual sex and rape are both good and they're exactly the same thing. But they're not, and we know that because one of them does harm and the other one does not. But unfortunately, when it comes to the current climate with mental health and mental health research, they are lumped into the same category even though they have significantly different outcomes. So the mechanism, which is consistent throughout both meditation, mindfulness, prayer, is the same mechanism which is also present in things like falling asleep, the hypnagogic state. It's also a brainwave frequency that you can get from listening to music. So there are a number of different brainwave frequencies, and I'll put a chart right here. Our alert wakeful state is known as beta waves. Alpha waves are known as a transitional kind of frequency where you're sort of going from the wakeful state into a more calm, relaxed, receptive state. And it's the receptivity of the mental state which actually makes it both good and dangerous. It's like a double-edged sword, because alpha waves are also associated with hypnosis. And as you can probably tell, hypnosis can be used for good, it can also be used for evil. So you can use it to help someone to give up an addiction, but you can also use it to implant false memories. Another thing which is associated with alpha brainwaves is what's known as sleep paralysis. And so this is where you are either coming out of sleep or going into sleep. And in that hypnagogic or hypnopompic state, you can actually experience some really terrifying things. From a Christian perspective, sleep paralysis is not a benign mechanism. It's actually a spiritual attack. And there are a lot of people in the paranormal community who agree with that. The visitations are almost universal, like people see exactly the same thing, whether they are from different cultures or throughout different time periods. One of the quintessential phenomenon of sleep paralysis is what's known as the hag. And this is an entity that sits on someone's chest and starts choking them out. In this alpha state, people can experience all kinds of hallucinations or what is attributed to hallucinations. But they're fairly consistent as well. People hear high-pitched electrical noises. They can also hear things like someone shouting their name. And it's often a voice that they recognize, but it's not someone who's there. It can even be someone who is technically dead. Furthermore, the New Age actually teaches people how to use this alpha brainwave state to do things like astral travel and lucid dreaming. These are overtly spiritual activities, and there are all kinds of reports from people who have tried astral travel and lucid dreaming where they encounter different entities and have some very strange and very terrifying experiences. So from a mechanistic standpoint, this is a very powerful tool, and it can be used for both the good aspects and the really, really terrible demonic aspects. As I said before, mechanism does not equal good. Just because something is using the same entry point doesn't mean that it's from God, and doesn't mean that it is there for your benefit. So as I said before, a lot of the meditation practices that are being recommended by various different mental health experts are based on Eastern meditation practices, in particular Buddhism. So we're going to take a look at an article which was published in The Atlantic in 2014, which outlines what the Buddhist tradition actually says and also what Buddhist teachers actually say. There is a sutta, a canonical discourse attributed to the Buddha or one of his close disciples, where monks go crazy and commit suicide after doing contemplation on death. For Britain, this widespread assumption that meditation exists only for stress reduction and labour productivity, because that's what Americans value, narrows the scope of the scientific lens. Britain also questions what might be considered the mindfulness movement's limited scope. She explains that the Theravada Buddhist tradition influences how a large portion of Americans practice meditation, but in it, mindfulness is about vipassana, a specific type of insight into the three characteristics of experience. These are also known as the three marks of existence: anicca, or impermanence, dukkha, or dissatisfaction, and anatta, or no self. Shinzen Young says, "Almost everyone who gets anywhere with meditation will pass through periods of negative emotion, confusion, and disorientation. The same can happen in psychotherapy and other growth modalities. I would not refer to these type of experiences as dark night. I would reserve the term for a somewhat rarer phenomenon. Within the Buddhist tradition, this is sometimes referred to as falling into the pit of the void. It entails an authentic and irreversible insight into emptiness and no self. Instead of being empowering and fulfilling, it turns into the opposite. In a sense, it's enlightenment's evil twin." So, as you can see from those snippets from the article, a lot of what they're actually aiming for in Eastern meditation is essentially an existential crisis. If they're trying to obtain enlightenment through the process of mental deconstruction, where they concentrate on the concept of no self, dissatisfaction, and impermanence, that is existentialism in a nutshell. But the thing is that no one is actually informed about this before they start that practice. And it's almost treated as like a normal part of the process that you are going to go through a mental crisis, and somehow you just have to muddle your way through it and keep doing the practice that is making you freak out. The fact that historically they know that this makes people go insane and kill themselves. It's exactly the same problem that we see with serotonin reuptake inhibitors, where they can actually make people who were previously not at all suicidal suddenly become suicidal. Like, why risk it? According to an article by Medical News Today, they conducted a survey of people who actually practice meditation on a regular basis. So these are seasoned practitioners. They're not people who are just randomly coming to it as a one-off. They surveyed over 1,200 people, and what they found is that a good quarter of them have some kind of significant mental health event from meditation. A quarter. 1 in 4 people. Like, if you had a group of 3 friends with you, one of you is going to have a psychotic meltdown at some point in meditation. Those numbers are insane. That is insane. If this was a drug, it would never, ever reach human trial. And the thing is, that might actually be a conservative estimate, because we're now in this culture where if you have a mental breakdown from meditation, they blame you for doing it wrong. But the same research done in 1992 actually found about 63% go through a mental health crisis. So this is potentially being underreported. It's definitely being understudied. The article from The Guardian, which had that 1992 study quoted in it, also went on to talk about why this would be the case. And from the research they did, it's all economic. It's entirely based on greed. For one thing, this is a multi-million-dollar, if not billion-dollar industry. There are a lot of invested interests in this. And on top of that, it's a really great way for unscrupulous employers to completely abandon their employees by basically saying, if you can't manage your stress, that is your fault. It's not my fault for putting all of the stress onto you, it's your fault for not handling it. So rather than like easing off on the stress that they inflict on their employees, it just simply gives them an out. So as I mentioned before, there was an article published in The Atlantic, and the article is entirely about a research doctorate who she not only identified that there are huge gaps in the research and has taken it upon herself to actually conduct that research, but she has created a facility which is a recovery place for people who have had psychotic breaks in meditation. She runs a rehab center for meditation because these people are just basically abandoned by everyone. They're told that they didn't do it right. They're told that it's their own fault. Some of the stories are horrific, so I'm going to share some of the stories from The Atlantic and some of the stories from The Guardian.
Claire was sent on a 3-day mindfulness course with colleagues as part of a training program. Initially I found it relaxing, she says, but then I found I felt completely zoned out while doing it. Within 2 or 3 hours of later sessions, I was starting to really panic. The sessions resurfaced memories of her traumatic childhood, and she experienced a series of panic attacks. Somehow the course triggered things I had previously got over, Claire says. I had a breakdown and spent 3 months in a psychiatric unit. It was a depressive breakdown with psychotic elements related to the trauma and several dissociative episodes. 4.5 years later, Claire is still working part-time and is in and out of hospital. She became addicted to alcohol when previously she was driven and high-performing, and believes mindfulness was the catalyst for her breakdown. Her doctors have advised her to avoid relaxation methods, and she spent months in one-on-one therapy. Louise, a woman in her 50s who had been practicing yoga for 20 years, went away to a meditation retreat. While meditating, she felt dissociated from herself and became worried. Dismissing it as a routine side effect of meditation, Louise continued with the exercises. The following day, after returning home, her body felt completely numb and she didn't want to get out of bed. Her husband took her to the doctor who referred her to a psychiatrist. For the next 15 years, she was treated for psychotic depression. After a few months of following guided meditations and feeling increasingly anxious, Rachel had what she describes as a meltdown immediately after practicing some of the techniques she'd learned. The relationship she was in broke down. That's the horrible hangover I have from this. Instead of having a sense of calm, I overanalyze and scrutinize everything. Things would run round in my mind and suddenly I'd be doing things that were totally out of character, acting very erratically, having panic attacks that would restrict my breathing and once sent me into a blackout seizure on the studio floor that involved an ambulance trip to accident and emergency. Rachel has recovered to some extent. She experiences similar feelings on a lower level even today, but has learned to recognize the symptoms and take steps to combat them. The morning after our Shabbat dinner in Britain's kitchen, David outlines the history of his own contemplative path. His first retreat was very non-normal, he says, and very good, divine. There was stuff dropping away and electric shocks through my body. My core sense of self, a persistent consciousness, the thoughts and stuff were not me. He tells me it was the best thing that had ever happened to him. An orgasm of the soul felt throughout my internal world. David explains that he finally felt awake, but it didn't last. I started having thoughts like, let me take over you, combined with confusion and tons of terror, says David, a polite, articulate 27-year-old who arrived at Britain's Cheetah House in 2013. I had a vision of death and a scythe and a hood and the thought, kill yourself, over and over again. Michael, 25, was a certified yoga teacher when he made his way to Cheetah House. He explains that during the course of his meditation practice, his body stopped digesting food. I had no idea what was happening. For 3 years, he believed he was permanently ruined by meditation. Psychological hell is how he describes it. It would come and go in waves. I'd be in the middle of practice, and what would come to mind was everything I didn't want to think about, every feeling I didn't want to feel. David felt pebble-sized spasms emerge from inside a dense knot in his belly. He panicked. Increasingly vivid pornographic fantasies and repressed memories from his childhood began to surface. I just started freaking out, he says, and at some point I just surrendered to the onslaught of unwanted sexual thoughts, a sexual Rolodex of every taboo. As soon as he did, however, there was some goodness to it. After years of pushing away his emotional, instinctual drives, something inside David was reattached, he said. Towards the end of his time at the Cloud Mountain Center, David shared his ongoing experiences with the retreat leaders, who assured him it was probably just his ego's defenses acting up. They were really comforting, he says. even though I thought I was going to become schizophrenic.
So yeah, as you can see there, entirely victim blaming and not at all reassessing the actual practice. But love and light. As I mentioned before, a lot of the Eastern philosophy and the Eastern meditation practices are very, very similar to existentialism. Existentialism as a school of philosophy really only came up around the 1930s, 1940s, and it was mostly fronted by a man by the name of Sartre. But he was building upon other schools of philosophy that had come before him, and he was building upon the works of people like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, and even Karl Marx. So existentialism kind of proposes that every man is an island, at least emotionally and cognitively, but that they're also forced to interact with other people and are subject to the whims of other people. It also proposes that the only thing that we really have is our mere existence, and we have to make some kind of meaning out of it. So they like to say that life is meaningless, but that we create our own meaning. Which then kind of goes into the territory of like self-creation, and they take some of the works of St. Augustine, who was a Catholic saint, and he wrote during the 4th and 5th centuries. I'm going to get into Augustine very shortly because he is also referenced by Christians, and the way that the existentialists have used his work is out of context. So they use his work to substantiate the claim that there is only the interior world for reference. You can only derive meaning from within, and you are self-created. In spite of that, it's fairly atheist at its core, because it generally rejects any kind of supernatural forces, and even to the point where it kind of rejects consciousness. So according to the existentialists, we're all just atoms randomly bumping into each other until we die. It is partly built on the philosophy of nihilism, which proposes that our existence is futile. So the concept of existential dread is when you come to this awareness that we're just staving off the inevitable dread of death and annihilation. And in the interim, we have to deal with this constant state of despair. And so in the West, out of this school of thought has come the practice of adopting Eastern meditation, which aligns with it. In that study that I quoted, where it said that 25 or more % of people who do meditation experience a psychotic episode at some point, they actually did pinpoint what the risk factors were. So for the people who did experience adverse psychological reactions to meditation, the main overarching factors were being male, not having any kind of religious belief system, and going to a meditation retreat. So if you're a dude who is so woke, enlightened, and edgy that you basically cut people with your intellect, and you then go on a meditation retreat, you are a psychotic breakdown waiting to happen. The thing about existentialism is that it is based in the overarching schools of modern and postmodern philosophy. And both of those can kind of be summarized as a rejection and a rebellion against the notion of God. And for some reason, human beings are absolutely fascinated with the void of existential ceasing to exist. And it's this fascination with darkness that tends to lead us down the wrong path. The big problem that we often have in our human experience is that we are not designed to be separated from God. We have these mechanisms built into us, like the alpha waves. These mechanisms are there so that we can have that relationship with God, but we tend to pervert it, and those same mechanisms get hijacked by the other guys. Experiencing separation from God causes a huge amount of suffering in our lives. As Douglas Murray has described it, these days we have got a God-shaped hole. A God-shaped hole in our hearts and a God-shaped hole in our minds. And what we fail to understand is that God also has that feeling of separation from us. That's what the symbolism of the Sacred Heart refers to, is the fact that we break God's heart, but also that it beats for us, as our hearts should be beating for Him. Why are mental health practitioners continuing to flog this particular dead horse? Well, as I mentioned before, there is the greed factor. There's also the fact that there is not enough study actually done into the risks, and most of the studies that are out there include prayer as though they are the same thing, and they are not the same thing. So now we need to go into how prayer is different to Eastern meditation. So there is a huge difference between meditating on existential dread or basic bodily functions and actually praying. NBC News published an article which was all about meditation and prayer. So again, they conflated prayer and meditation, but within the article, they specifically mentioned prayer, and it is very different to meditation. So they looked at a number of studies, in particular alcoholics who had been through the Alcoholics Anonymous program, which is Christian-based, and they saw through the brain scans that they were doing while they subjected them to the temptation of alcohol, that when they started praying, it actually shut down addictive areas of the brain and re-engaged emotional control. The article also looked at the neurochemical science behind prayer, which features quite heavily with oxytocin. If you're not familiar with oxytocin, it's basically the bonding hormone. So it's the hormone that comes up when people fall in love. It's also heightened during breastfeeding and bonding with babies, and it's present in general family bonds. So essentially, what happens when you pray is you establish a family relationship with God. You relate to Him as a parent who is there to protect you and look after you. It's not about making your problems disappear. It's about giving you the moral and emotional support you need in order to face your problems. So now we're going to get back to St. Augustine. What did he actually write, which was taken out of context by the existentialists? And what is prayer and what is Christian meditation? So Pope Benedict, back when he was still known as Cardinal Ratzinger, he wrote an article for the cardinals, and it was to deal with the topic of stress and navigating the digital age.
The spiritual restlessness arising from a life subjected to the driving pace of a technologically advanced society brings a certain number of Christians to seek in these methods of prayer a path to interior peace and psychic balance. Without doubt, a Christian needs certain periods of retreat into solitude to be recollected and in God's presence rediscover his path. On this topic, St. Augustine is an excellent teacher. If you want to find God, he says, abandon the exterior world and re-enter into yourself. However, he continues, do not remain in yourself, but go beyond yourself, because you are not God. He is deeper and greater than you. To remain in oneself, this is the real danger.
So as you can see, St. Augustine was not about just staying within yourself, but going beyond that. He understood the principle even back then, before we understood anything about neurobrain chemicals. He understood that you had to build a relationship with God, and that if you got stuck in being very self-centered, then you were in real danger. So in Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 to 8, it says,
Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Jesus Christ. Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue, and if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things.
And that's the basis of Christian meditation. That is the basis of meditating on the Word of God. So prayer is a number of things. Prayer is asking for help. Prayer is also giving thanks for the things that you have, expressing gratitude. These are all concepts that people like Brené Brown do all of these talks on, but this is already being taught in Christianity. And prayer is also about relinquishing some of the control and some of the pressure off of yourself and allowing God to share it with you. It's not supposed to be about paying attention to your own breath and the existential heat death of the universe. Sometimes it just seems like people are so determined not to have God in their lives that they will literally do anything, including things that are incredibly self-detrimental. But if what you're really looking for is true peace, you're not going to find it concentrating on your own breath. And that's why it makes a lot of sense that those studies which found that people who are men and don't have any religious belief and go to meditation retreats end up in these particular situations, because having that kind of faith is a bit of an inoculation against psychotic breakdown. I mean, it's not going to be perfect because it really depends on what the circumstances of your life are, but it's definitely a good place to start if you're in great need. Because rather than just becoming overwhelmed by it, you can actually find someone to turn to. Alright guys, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed that and got something out of it. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time. Bye.